The Messerschmitt Bf 109 pilot glanced at his fuel gauge and felt his stomach tighten. 20 minutes of combat fuel remaining. Maybe. The channel stretched below grey and cold and utterly unforgiving. His wingman had already turned back with engine trouble. Another aircraft from his staffel had gone down over Kent. He'd seen the parachute at least. Now British fighters were climbing to intercept, and his gauge showed he had perhaps 10 minutes before he had to break off and run for France, whether the fight was finished or not. This was the reality of fighting the Battle of Britain from a Bf 109 cockpit. Every pilot knew the mathematics. Every sortie was a race against the fuel gauge. The Luftwaffe had the most advanced fighter in the world, faster than the Hurricane, equal to or better than the Spitfire in most performance categories, but they were fighting at the absolute limit of their range, and that single fact poisoned every tactical advantage they possessed. The Bf 109, a the E variant that equipped most Luftwaffe fighter units in 1940, was a superb aircraft. It had dominated Polish skies in 1939, swept French opposition aside in 1940, and established Luftwaffe air superiority wherever it operated. The 109 could outclimb the Spitfire WWII. Its fuel-injected Daimler-Benz DB601 engine gave it superior performance in negative G maneuvers a critical advantage in combat. The aircraft could dive away from trouble without the engine cutting out something the carbureted Merlin engine in British fighters couldn't do reliably. The 109's armament hit hard, with two 20mm cannon in the wings and two 7.92mm machine guns in the nose. But none of that mattered if you ran out of fuel over England. From French airfields to London measured roughly 150 miles. The Bf 109E had a combat radius of about 125 miles under ideal conditions, cruising at economical speeds, no extended combat, no emergencies. Combat conditions were never ideal. Pilots flew at high power settings. They maneuvered violently. They ran engines at maximum emergency power during combat. Fuel consumption soared. A 10-minute dogfight could burn through fuel reserves that represented 30 minutes of cruising flight. The Luftwaffe tried everything to extend range. They fitted external drop tanks to some aircraft centerline fuel tanks that could be jettisoned before combat. The tanks helped, but they also degraded performance. The 109 flew slower and handled worse with a drop tank attached. Worse, the tanks were in short supply. Many sorties flew without them. Pilots learned to nurse their fuel flying as efficiently as possible, watching the gauge constantly calculating and recalculating whether they had enough to reach England, engage, and make it home. The psychological pressure was relentless. British pilots fought over their own country. If they took damage, if their fuel ran low, they could land at any of dozens of airfields scattered across southern England. If they had to bail out, they landed among friends. They'd be back in action within hours, sometimes the same day. German pilots knew that any damage, any fuel shortage, any mechanical problem over England meant death or captivity. Ditching in the Channel killed most pilots. The water was cold enough to induce hypothermia in minutes, and air-sea rescue for Luftwaffe pilots was minimal. The Channel was wide enough that most downed pilots couldn't be spotted, let alone rescued. Parachuting over England meant imprisonment for the rest of the war. This knowledge shaped every decision. British pilots could afford to be aggressive. They could chase German aircraft, press attacks, take chances. Luftwaffe pilots had to constantly balance aggression against fuel reserves. Break off too early and you fail your mission. Press too hard and you run out of fuel over the Channel. The calculation was always there, a running countdown in the back of your mind. Tactically, the 109 could match the Spitfire. The aircraft had similar top speeds. The 109E was slightly faster at some altitudes, the Spitfire faster at others. The differences were marginal. Both aircraft could hit roughly 350 to 360 mph in level flight. What mattered more was how they got to that speed and what they could do when they got there. The 109 accelerated faster in a dive. That fuel-injected engine kept producing power when the nose pointed down. Spitfire pilots who tried to dive away from a 109 often found their engines cutting out momentarily as fuel starvation hit the carburetor. Those few seconds of lost power could be fatal. Luftwaffe pilots exploited this ruthlessly. Attack from above, make a high-speed firing pass, then dive away before the British fighters could respond. By the time the Spitfire's engine caught again, the 109 was out of range. But turn with a Spitfire, and you were in trouble. The British fighter had a tighter turning radius, particularly at lower speeds. The broader wing gave it more lift. In a sustained turning fight, the Spitfire could gradually work inside the 109's turn and bring guns to bear. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots knew not to accept that fight. Keep your speed up. Use vertical maneuvers. Don't get slow. The 109's narrow landing gear created problems. The gear legs attached near the fuselage centerline and splayed outward to the wheels, making the aircraft unstable during takeoff and landing. Ground accidents were common. Pilots had to stay alert during what should have been the routine parts of the flight. More 109s were lost to landing accidents than British pilots would have believed. But once airborne, the 109 was a pilot's aircraft. Light on the controls, responsive, powerful. You could throw it around the sky. The aircraft did what you told it to do without argument. For pilots, used to the 109's handling, it felt natural, intuitive. They knew its limits and how to exploit its strengths. The cannon armament gave 109 pilots an advantage in firepower. The British relied primarily on .303 caliber machine guns, 8 in the Spitfire, 8 in the Hurricane, lethal against unarmored aircraft, but less effective against newer designs with armor protection. The 109's 20mm cannon could destroy an enemy aircraft with a handful of hits. One good burst from the MGFF cannon could tear a wing off or explode a fuel tank. The problem was ammunition. The MGFF carried only 60 rounds per gun. A 2-second burst fired half your cannon ammunition. Pilots learned to hold fire until they were certain of a hit. The machine guns had more ammunition, 1,000 rounds per gun, but were primarily useful for ranging shots and finishing off damaged targets. The cannon did the real work, which meant marksmanship mattered enormously. British pilots could afford to spray bullets. 8 machine guns with 300 rounds per gun meant 2 400 rounds of ammunition. They could fire longer bursts, take longer range shots, hope for lucky hits. German pilots had to be precise. This favoured experienced pilots who could judge range and deflection, who could lead their targets properly and fire at the exact right moment. For less experienced pilots, the limited cannon ammunition was a handicap. The tactical situation created constant frustration for Luftwaffe fighters. Their primary mission wasn't to hunt Spitfires, it was to escort bombers. The bomber formations were slow flying at perhaps 200 Meter altitude. Fighter escorts had to weave back and forth above the bombers to avoid stalling burning fuel, constantly never able to position themselves optimally for the inevitable British attacks. When RAF fighters appeared, the 109 pilots faced impossible choices. Dive to engage, and you leave the bombers unprotected. Stay with the bombers, and you surrender altitude and position to the enemy. The British could bounce the bombers from above, while the escorts struggled to respond. German fighter pilots watched bombers get shot down and knew they couldn't prevent it. Couldn't leave their assigned positions to chase enemy fighters, couldn't be everywhere at once. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring blamed the fighters for bomber losses. He demanded they stay closer to the formations. He wanted them flying in tight formation with the bombers, where they'd be tactically useless. Fighter pilots tried to explain that altitude and speed were their weapons, that sticking close to slow bombers made the escorts sitting targets. Göring didn't listen. The recriminations poisoned morale. Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's top aces, famously requested a squadron of Spitfires. When Göring asked what he needed to win the battle, the comment was sardonic, bitter, a reflection of the impossible position fighter pilots found themselves in. They had good aircraft. They had skilled pilots. They had courage and training. But they were being asked to do something fundamentally impossible: escort bombers deep into enemy territory, fight at a disadvantage, and do it all at the absolute limit of their fuel range. The propaganda didn't help. German newspapers printed stories about the cowardly British fighters refusing to engage about Luftwaffe dominance, about the inevitable victory. Pilots read these accounts and wondered what war the reporters were describing. British fighters engaged constantly. They fought hard. They were brave and skilled, and very much not defeated. The disconnect between propaganda and reality created cynicism. Pilots learned not to believe official reports. They trusted what they saw with their own eyes and what their friends told them. They knew the British were not on the verge of collapse. They knew the Luftwaffe was taking steady losses it couldn't easily replace. They knew the fuel situation wasn't getting better. Pilot psychology shifted through the summer and fall of 1940. Early confidence gave way to grim determination, then to exhaustion. Fighter pilots flew multiple sorties per day, every day with no break. Losses mounted. Friends disappeared. New replacement pilots arrived from training units with minimal experience and died quickly. The veterans grew weary. There was also respect for their opponents. British pilots flew aggressively. They attacked despite numerical disadvantage. They defended their country with obvious courage. German pilots recognized this. The RAF wasn't beaten. It wasn't even close to beaten. Every raid met fierce resistance. Every bomber formation took losses. The Spitfire became a symbol. When you encountered Hurricanes, you knew you had a performance advantage. The Hurricane was tough and well armed, but slower than the 109, less maneuverable in the vertical plane. You could fight Hurricanes with confidence, but Spitfires were different. The Spitfire could match you. It could turn with you. In the hands of a good pilot, it was deadly. German pilots developed a grudging admiration for the aircraft. It was beautiful, sleek, purposeful, obviously built by people who understood aerodynamics and combat. It looked fast sitting on the ground. In the air, it moved like it belonged there. Luftwaffe pilots recognized quality when they saw it. The tactical evolution of the battle worked against the Luftwaffe. The British got better. They refined their tactics. They learned to vector fighters to intercepts using radar and ground control. They stopped flying rigid formations and adopted more flexible tactics. Their pilot training improved. New pilots arrived with better preparation, better understanding of what worked in combat. The Luftwaffe didn't evolve fast enough. Doctrine remained rigid. Formation flying remained tight and predictable. Bombers continued to attack in broad daylight at medium altitude, where British fighters could intercept them easily. Fighter escorts continued to be tied to the bombers, unable to hunt freely or establish air superiority before the bombers arrived. By September, the writing was on the wall. The Luftwaffe wasn't achieving air superiority. British fighter strength wasn't declining. If anything, it was increasing as production and training ramped up. Every raid cost aircraft and pilots. The replacements coming from training units were adequate at best. Experienced pilots were exhausted. The 109 pilots knew it was failing before the high command admitted it. You could see it in the combat reports. More bomber losses, more fighter losses. The British weren't breaking. Their radar stations stayed operational despite attacks. Their airfields repaired damage quickly. Fighter squadrons remained effective. The switch to night bombing in September tacitly admitted defeat. The Luftwaffe couldn't win air superiority in daylight. The fighters couldn't protect the bombers. The bombers couldn't survive without fighter protection. Night bombing abandoned precision but reduced losses. It was an admission that the original strategy had failed. For the 109 pilots, the Battle of Britain became a lesson in limitations. You could have a good aircraft, good pilots, good training, but tactics and logistics mattered more. Fighting at the extreme edge of your range negated most of your advantages. Escorting bombers in rigid formations surrendered the initiative to the enemy. No amount of individual skill or aircraft performance could overcome systematic disadvantages. The irony was that the 109 would go on to compile a remarkable combat record. On the Eastern Front in North Africa in the Mediterranean, the aircraft dominated. Without the range limitations, without the impossible escort mission, the 109 was exactly what it was designed to be, a superb fighter that could compete with anything the Allies fielded. But over Britain in 1940, all that potential was squandered. The fuel gauges ran down toward empty. The channel stretched below. British fighters climbed to intercept. And 109 pilots made the same calculations their predecessors had made that morning and the morning before. Can I fight and still make it home? Often the answer was no. Not because the aircraft failed, not because the pilots lacked courage or skill, but because the mission itself was flawed from the beginning. You cannot establish air superiority when you can only stay over the battlefield for minutes at a time. You cannot protect bombers effectively when you're worried about fuel reserves. You cannot win a battle of attrition when every loss has to be replaced from bases hundreds of miles away, while your enemy operates from fields minutes from the combat zone. The Spitfire pilots flying from British airfields understood they had this advantage. They knew the Germans were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. It didn't make the German pilots less dangerous. A 109 flown by an experienced pilot was still deadly, but it meant the strategic situation favoured Britain. German pilots understood this too. They flew their missions. They fought as hard as they could. They followed orders and did their duty. But they knew they were being asked to do the impossible. The propaganda claimed victory was imminent. The pilots knew better. They watched the fuel gauges. They counted the distance to the coast. They calculated how many minutes of combat they could afford before they had to run for home. That was the Battle of Britain from the other side. Not a glorious campaign of aerial superiority, but a grinding war of attrition fought under impossible conditions. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was a fine aircraft. The pilots were skilled and brave, but they were fighting the wrong battle in the wrong place under the wrong conditions. The fuel gauge always ran too low, the channel was always too wide, and home was always just a little too far away.